As the room grows quiet, let your thoughts sail away. It is late. Late enough that the world has stopped asking anything of you. The emails have given up. The notifications have gone quiet. Even history, usually loud and demanding, seems willing to lower its voice for a while. This is the hour when stories do not rush. They drift. Tonight is not about heroes charging across battlefields or empires collapsing in spectacular flames. Those stories are energetic. They require attention. And attention is something we are not interested in right now. Tonight is slower than that. Heavier, softer around the edges. Tonight, history pulls up a chair, sighs deeply, and begins talking about something far more revealing than war. Dinner. Because when you strip away banners and titles, history often leaves behind a table. Scratched wood, grease stains, bones piled just a little too high. The quiet evidence of power being consumed, one bite at a time. Empires do not only conquer, they eat. They eat land, resources, labor, and time. And eventually they eat themselves. But they never start with that part. They start with banquets. There is something oddly comforting about thinking of the past this way. Rulers who once seemed terrifying become very human when you imagine them chewing too loudly, reaching for another serving, pretending not to notice how much has already disappeared. Power looks different when it is holding a spoon. In the late hours, the mind is less interested in glory and more curious about habits. What people did every day, what they demanded repeatedly, what they needed so badly that entire systems bent to support it, and nothing reveals daily demand like food. Food is honest. It does not care about speeches or lineage. It demands logistics, planning, repetition. If something fails, people notice immediately, especially the person at the center of the table. Some rulers ruled with law, some ruled with fear, some ruled with charisma, and some ruled by creating an appetite so large that the world reorganized itself to keep feeding it. That kind of power does not shout. It hums, slowly, constantly, like digestion. This is the kind of history best told at night, not because it is frightening, but because it is unsettling in a quieter way. It makes you wonder how many systems exist, not because they are noble, but because someone, somewhere, is still hungry. As you listen, you may find your thoughts drifting. That is fine. History does not mind being half heard. It has been patient for centuries. Let your breathing slow. Let the edges of the day blur. Imagine a vast space lit by firelight, where the sound of conversation blends with the steady rhythm of cutting, pouring, chewing. Imagine a table so large, it barely feels like furniture anymore. More like geography. Somewhere at its center sits a figure who does not need to raise his voice. Everything already moves toward him. Animals, grain, spices, people, effort. Not because he asks politely, but because the system has learned that feeding him is safer than not. There is something faintly absurd about this, if you allow yourself to notice it. An empire bending itself into shape to support a single daily routine. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, and something in between, just in case. History textbooks rarely linger here. They prefer decisive moments. We prefer repetition, because repetition reveals what power truly costs. Tonight, nothing will hurry you. There will be no moral lessons delivered with sharp edges, just observations, calm, measured, occasionally amused by how serious people once were about things that now sound faintly ridiculous. And yet, these ridiculous things worked for a while. That is the unsettling part. So settle in. Let the night hold the story for you. Let history speak softly with a hint of dry humor, as it describes not how an empire was built, but how it was fed. To understand the scale of this story, it helps to forget the image of a ruler issuing commands from a throne. That image is tidy, efficient, and deeply misleading. The ruler we are approaching tonight is better understood not as a general or administrator, but as the gravitational center of an enormous logistical system. Everything moved toward him, not in dramatic bursts, but in steady, predictable streams. Food did not arrive as gifts. It arrived as obligation. This was not indulgence in the modern sense, it was expectation, a routine so normalized that entire regions adjusted their output accordingly. Herds were raised with specific futures in mind. Fields were planted knowing exactly where their harvest would end up. The table was not separate from governance. It was governance, just expressed in calories. What makes this especially interesting is how little subtlety was involved. There was no attempt to disguise excess as moderation, no effort to pretend restraint. Abundance was not a side effect of power. It was the performance of power. If you were invited to dine, you were not there to enjoy yourself. You were there to witness scale, to feel small without being told to feel small, to sit, eat, drink, and slowly realize that this was not hospitality. It was demonstration. The food did not whisper generosity. It announced control. Control over land, over labor, over time, and over the quiet understanding that this could happen again tomorrow and the day after that, without interruption. There is a faint irony here, and history seems aware of it. The more impressive the feast, the more fragile the system behind it. Every excess required maintenance. Every display demanded repetition. Appetite, once institutionalized, becomes very difficult to satisfy. And so, as we begin this journey into the mechanics of imperial consumption, it helps to listen not for triumph, but for strain. Beneath the calm surface of endless food lies a system working very hard to pretend this is normal. Tonight, we are not counting victories. We are counting what disappeared to make them possible. And it all begins, quite quietly, with the first dish placed on the table. Chapter 1: An Empire that Began at the Dinner Table. Late at night, history changes its posture. It stops standing upright and slowly sits down beside you. Its voice lowers, its movements soften. The urgency that usually surrounds dates and battles quietly slips away, replaced by something calmer and more patient. This is the hour when history is willing to speak about ordinary things, the kind that repeat themselves every day, without ceremony or applause. At this hour, it feels natural to begin not with conquest, but with routine, not with violence, but with consumption, not with the clash of armies, but with the steady rhythm of eating. Empires, after all, do not live on victories alone. They live on systems, and systems require fuel. Food is the most reliable fuel history has ever known. It arrives on time or everything else stops working. It demands planning, cooperation, and obedience. And once it becomes predictable, it creates a sense of calm that power finds very appealing. In the world of Kublai Khan, this calm was carefully maintained, not through silence or fear alone, but through certainty. The certainty that meals would appear, that abundance would be visible, that nothing at the center of power would ever feel scarce. This was not luxury in the modern sense. Luxury suggests excess for pleasure. What existed here was excess for reassurance. A daily reminder that the system was functioning, that the empire was intact, and that tomorrow would look very much like today. Kublai Khan sat at the center of this arrangement, not as a man anxiously waiting to be served, but as a fixed point around which everything else moved. Animals were raised with an ending already decided. Fields were planted with destinations already known. Kitchens operated like clockwork, not to impress, but to repeat. There is something almost gentle about this repetition. No surprises, no improvisation, just the steady delivery of proof. Each meal quietly confirmed that roads remained open, labor remained compliant, and resources continued to flow in the expected direction. Power prefers not to be questioned, and food, arriving on schedule, is one of the most effective ways to avoid questions. When the table is full, uncertainty feels distant. Hunger becomes someone else's problem. There is a faint irony here, one that history does not bother to hide. An empire stretching across vast distances, supported daily by something as biologically simple as eating. One person consuming calmly while thousands of unseen lives adjusted themselves to support that calm. The humor is dry, almost invisible. It lies in how ordinary it all seems. No speeches are needed, no announcements required. The table itself delivers the message. This will continue. This is normal. This is how things are meant to be. At night, when the world grows quieter, this arrangement feels heavier than armor, not because it is loud or cruel, but because it is stable. Stability, once achieved, becomes its own kind of power. This is not a story about hunger. It is a story about confidence. The confidence that comes from knowing that the system will always provide, that nothing needs to change, that the center will hold because it is being fed. And so, before any borders are drawn or orders are given, the empire begins here, at a table, calm, predictable, waiting patiently for the next meal to arrive. Seen from the outside, this system appears almost peaceful. There is no visible strain, no sense of urgency, no indication that anything could go wrong. Food moves inward, waste moves outward. The process repeats. It is quiet enough that it barely feels like power at all. This quietness is intentional. Power, when functioning properly, does not like to announce itself. It prefers to be assumed. The constant presence of abundance allows authority to feel natural, inevitable, and unquestionable. In Kublai Khan's world, the table was not separate from governance. It was governance expressed through routine rather than command. Each dish served was a small confirmation that the empire still worked, that the countless details required to sustain it had aligned once again. The people who made this possible were rarely visible. Their labor disappeared into the process, just as completely as the food itself. This invisibility was not accidental. Systems of power tend to hide what sustains them, allowing the center to appear effortless and composed. There is a strange comfort in this illusion. When everything arrives on time, it becomes easy to believe that it always will, that the flow of resources is permanent, that appetite and supply will remain perfectly balanced forever. History, however, is rarely that kind. It records this confidence carefully, often with a quiet sense of irony. For every system that appears calm, there is strain being absorbed elsewhere. For every table that remains full, there are countless adjustments happening beyond sight. Yet from the center, none of this needs to be acknowledged. The meal arrives, the day continues, the repetition reinforces itself. Over time, excess stops feeling excessive and starts feeling necessary. This is where consumption becomes symbolic. It is no longer about nourishment. It is about visibility, about demonstrating that the empire can afford not to count. That restraint is unnecessary. That abundance is the default setting. There is something unsettling about how soothing this feels. The absence of urgency, the predictability, the gentle rhythm of routine. It lulls both ruler and observer into believing that this balance is permanent. At night, this realization drifts slowly through the mind. Power does not always demand attention. Sometimes it simply eats, calmly and confidently, trusting that the system will continue to serve it. The table becomes a mirror. It reflects not only what is being consumed, but what is being assumed. That resources are endless, that labor is obedient, that tomorrow will always resemble today. History watches these moments closely, though it rarely interrupts them. It allows the repetition to continue, knowing that systems built on constant consumption eventually reveal their limits, not suddenly, but gradually. For now, however, the table remains full, the atmosphere stays calm, the illusion holds, and the empire rests comfortably in the belief that its appetite is not a vulnerability, but a strength. This is how power settles into routine, quietly, confidently, one meal at a time. Chapter 2. When cooking became a matter of state. Late at night, when the mind loosens its grip on urgency, it becomes easier to imagine how something as ordinary as a kitchen could quietly grow into a pillar of empire. Not a cozy kitchen, not the kind that smells like comfort and familiarity, but something far larger, more deliberate, and strangely impersonal. A kitchen that does not exist to please, but to function. A kitchen that does not cook for taste, but for certainty. In the imperial capital of Dadu, the palace kitchens were not hidden away like servants' quarters. They were vast, sprawling complexes that occupied space the way institutions do. Their size alone made a statement. This was not a place for improvisation. It was a place for scale. Fires burned continuously. Knives moved with practiced rhythm. Large quantities were not exceptional. They were expected. Thousands of people worked here, though rarely all at once in the imagination of history. They blur together into roles rather than faces. Butchers, cooks, carriers, cleaners, supervisors. Each task was narrow, specific, and endlessly repeated. No one here asked what the meal represented. They only knew what came next. This was not a kitchen that belonged to a household. it belonged to a system. Like any effective system, it was organized. Timetables mattered, deliveries were counted, losses were noted, everything that entered was recorded, and everything that left was accounted for. In many ways, it resembled an administrative office more than a place of nourishment. The difference was that its output disappeared quickly, leaving behind only the expectation that it would all happen again tomorrow. There is something oddly soothing about imagining such order late at night. The steady rhythm of labor, the predictability, the sense that even chaos, if processed correctly, can be made to behave. Cooking here was not an art, it was a procedure. Animals arrived not as individuals but as units. Their transformation from living creatures to prepared meals followed a process refined through repetition. Nothing was left to chance. Timing mattered, portions mattered, efficiency mattered. Taste, if considered at all, was secondary. In this environment, a mistake was not simply a culinary failure, it was a disruption. And disruptions in large systems are treated seriously. Food that arrived late or poorly prepared was more than an inconvenience. It suggested that something in the chain had failed. And failure, even in the kitchen, carried implications beyond the plate. This is where the irony quietly settles in. A place dedicated to feeding one person became a matter of state security. The smoother the kitchen ran, the calmer the empire appeared. The calmer the empire appeared, the stronger its authority felt. No speeches were needed, no threats required. The system enforced itself through repetition and expectation. Everyone knew what their role was. Everyone knew what would happen if the role was not fulfilled. At the center of it all, far removed from the heat and noise, the ruler remained insulated from effort. The kitchen absorbed the strain so that calm could exist elsewhere. This separation was essential. Power prefers distance from its own maintenance. Late at night, this arrangement feels both impressive and faintly unsettling. So much energy devoted to preserving the illusion of ease. So many lives synchronized around a daily routine that would never be noticed if it worked correctly. This was not about feeding hunger, it was about feeding stability. And stability, once institutionalized, becomes something worth protecting at all costs. From the outside, the palace kitchens appeared tireless. There was no visible fatigue, no pause long enough to suggest weakness. The system moved forward guided by routine rather than emotion. And because it worked, it faded into the background of imperial life, rarely acknowledged unless something went wrong. This invisibility was its greatest success. When a system becomes invisible, it feels permanent. It stops being questioned. The people who maintain it become part of the structure rather than individuals with limits. Late at night, it is easier to notice how quietly this happens, how effortlessly labor disappears into expectation. The kitchens of Dadu did not exist to impress guests or inspire creativity. They existed to remove uncertainty. Meals arrived not as surprises but as confirmations. Each successful service reinforced the belief that the empire remained orderly, disciplined, and under control. This belief mattered. When rulers feel certain, they govern differently. They become calmer, more deliberate, less inclined to doubt. A reliable kitchen in this sense was as valuable as a loyal army. Both ensured that nothing unexpected interrupted the rhythm of power. There is a dry humor in realizing How much authority depended on things going exactly as planned behind the scenes? A single poorly timed delivery, a shortage, or a mistake in preparation could ripple outward, not because of its material impact, but because of what it suggested. Disorder, even in food, threatened the image of inevitability. And so the kitchens were managed with the seriousness usually reserved for military operations. Schedules were enforced, processes refined, redundancies created, not because anyone feared hunger, but because no one wanted to risk embarrassment. In large empires, embarrassment is often treated as a form of vulnerability. Late at night, this focus on control feels strangely intimate. The empire, vast and impersonal, reveals its dependence on small, repeated actions. Cutting, stirring, carrying, cleaning, over and over again so the calm could exist elsewhere. The people performing these tasks rarely entered historical records. Their success ensured silence. Their failure would have made noise. History tends to notice noise more than stability, which is why kitchens often disappear from the narrative altogether. Yet without them, nothing else would function. This is the unsettling truth that settles gently in the quiet hours. Power rests on routines it pretends not to see. It depends on labor it does not acknowledge. And it protects these systems not because they are noble, but because they are necessary. As long as the kitchens worked, the empire could afford to appear effortless. Meals arrived, days continued. Decisions were made without interruption. The illusion held. At night, it becomes easier to sense how fragile that illusion really was. How much effort went into maintaining something that was never meant to be noticed. How much pressure was absorbed so that the center could remain still. Cooking in this world was not about nourishment or comfort. It was about continuity, about ensuring that tomorrow resembled today closely enough that no one felt the need to ask questions. And so the kitchens burned through the night steady and reliable, feeding not just a ruler, but the belief that the empire was secure, one meal at a time. Chapter 3. On the quiet art of turning livestock into statistics. Late at night, numbers feel strangely peaceful. They no longer rush toward conclusions or demand reactions. They simply exist, floating gently in the dark, asking to be observed rather than questioned. This is useful because the story of meat in Kublai Khan's empire is not emotional history. It is numerical history, softened by repetition. In this world, animals were never individuals for long. Sheep, cattle, goats, and horses entered the system already transformed into expectations. They were raised to fulfill forecasts, not destinies. Their lives were shaped by tallies made far from the fields where they grazed. Livestock existed as future quantities, counted early, counted often, adjusted when necessary. The empire did not wonder how many animals it could consume. It calculated how many it required to maintain confidence. Hunger was not the concern. Continuity was. There is something deeply calming about this logic, especially when heard at night. Nothing is rushed. Nothing is uncertain. Herds move because they are told to move. They disappear because disappearance has been scheduled. The system breathes slowly, evenly, like a sleeping giant convinced it will wake up, well-fed. Meat consumption reached a scale that made restraint irrelevant. Whole animals were prepared and served not because it was practical, but because it was visible. A single portion might satisfy hunger. An entire carcass satisfied symbolism. Quantity spoke louder than flavor ever could. At the banquet table, the message was simple. Counting had already been done. Moderation was unnecessary. The land, the herds, and the labor behind them were assumed to be endless. Excess was not indulgence. It was reassurance. This is where animals quietly stopped being food. They became evidence. Evidence that fields were productive, that supply routes were stable, that nothing essential was being drained fast enough to matter. The table did not ask questions, it displayed answers. Late at night, the irony settles gently. An empire famous for conquest, expressing its strength through arithmetic, lives translated into weight, bodies into totals, biology reduced to something neat enough to record. No one at the center needed to see the process. They only needed the result. Meat arrived, confidence followed, numbers updated themselves elsewhere, unseen and unquestioned. The animals vanished without ceremony. Statistics do not mourn, they refresh. This was not cruelty, it was efficiency. Large systems rarely feel cruel from the inside. They feel organized, calm, sensible. The absence of chaos creates the illusion of balance. And so the empire ate, night after night, reassured by numbers that never argued back. Livestock flowed inward. Consumption flowed outward. The system rested comfortably within its calculations, convinced that counting was the same as control. For now. From a distance, the banquets looked generous, almost warm. Firelight softened the edges of the tables. Smoke rose slowly, carrying the comforting illusion of abundance. Guests gathered, surrounded by so much food that hunger itself became irrelevant. This was never about eating well. It was about being seen eating endlessly. Whole animals arrived at the table as visual arguments. They were not cut delicately or portioned carefully. They were presented intact, heavy, and undeniable. One body communicated more than any speech. 10 bodies erased doubt completely. Quantity replaced persuasion. Late at night, it becomes easier to see how carefully this theater was constructed. The feast was not random. It followed a logic as precise as any ledger. Animals had been counted long before they were roasted. Their disappearance had already been approved. What remained was simply display. Guests were not meant to savor. They were meant to observe, to notice the scale, to internalize the message that this level of consumption was ordinary, repeatable, and safe. When excess is calm, it stops feeling excessive. It becomes expectation. Animals once transformed into numbers never returned to being lives. After the feast, they did not linger in memory. Statistics do not leave ghosts. They leave gaps that are quickly filled by the next delivery, the next count, the next adjustment. There is a quiet irony here that history rarely states aloud. An empire so confident in its control, reducing living systems to predictable disappearance. Not because it hated them, but because it trusted its calculations more than the world itself. Late at night, this trust feels fragile, but at the time it felt comforting. Numbers refreshed, herds replenished. The system corrected itself automatically. What could possibly go wrong when everything balanced so neatly on paper? The banquets reassured everyone involved. They reassured the ruler that supply remained steady. They reassured guests that power was stable. They reassured the system itself that consumption could continue without consequence. This reassurance was the true purpose of the feast. Meat was only the medium. Statistics were the message. Animals moved through the empire like quiet punctuation marks, commas in long sentences of logistics, periods marking the end of lives already accounted for. Nothing about them required attention once the numbers had been recorded. Large systems depend on this distance. When life becomes data, hesitation disappears. Decisions feel clean. Morality dissolves into efficiency. The table stays full. Confidence stays intact. And so the empire continued to eat, not urgently, not greedily, but calmly. The numbers promised stability. The numbers promised repetition. The numbers promised that tomorrow would resemble today closely enough to remain comfortable. For the moment, the statistics were convincing. Late at night, when repetition begins to feel heavier than spectacle, it becomes clear that numbers were not only tools of measurement, they were instruments of comfort. As long as the figures behaved, no one felt compelled to look beyond them. The empire did not listen to animals. It listened to totals. The rhythm was dependable. Herds were replenished, routes stayed open, losses were absorbed quietly, smoothed out by scale. When consumption is large enough, absence disappears into averages. A missing body becomes a rounding error. A shrinking herd becomes a temporary fluctuation. This is where statistics become soothing. They do not panic. They do not hesitate. They gently assure those who rely on them that nothing is wrong. Late at night, this assurance feels almost kind, like a lullaby made of numbers. The system did not ask whether the land was tiring. It asked whether the figures still aligned. As long as they did, concern was unnecessary. The table remained full. The banquets continued. Confidence stayed intact. Animals existed only briefly as living beings within this structure. Most of their lives were spent as expectations and projections. Their final form, as food, lasted only moments. What endured were the numbers that replaced them. Numbers are patient. They wait quietly to be referenced again. There is a gentle irony in how calm this made everything feel. An empire built on movement, conquest, and expansion, resting emotionally on ledgers. Stability achieved not through silence, but through arithmetic. Late at night, this calm begins to feel unsettling, not because it is loud, but because it is complete. There is no space for doubt when everything has already been counted. When every outcome appears anticipated, surprise becomes impossible. Yet history knows that surprise does not disappear. It simply waits. For now, though, the system slept well. Livestock flowed inward, meat flowed outward. The numbers refreshed themselves like clockwork. No one needed to raise their voice, no one needed to hurry. The empire believed that consumption and control were the same thing. That counting something meant understanding it. That turning life into data made it manageable, predictable, and safe. At the banquet table, this belief felt solid. It felt proven. It felt permanent. Late at night, permanence always feels convincing. The animals were gone. The numbers remained. Confidence followed the numbers, not the lives behind them. And as long as the figures stayed generous, the empire allowed itself to rest. This is how livestock became statistics, not through cruelty or chaos, but through calm repetition, through systems that worked too smoothly to be questioned, through comfort that made reflection unnecessary. For the moment, the calculations held. And the empire slept, certain that tomorrow's numbers would look just as reassuring as today's. Chapter 4: How to Conquer a Land with Starch. Late at night, history finally admits something it rarely says out loud during the day. Empires are not held together by drama, they are held together by routine, and nothing creates routine more reliably than starch. In Kublai Khan's world, rice, millet, wheat, and noodles did not simply accompany meals, they structured life. Meat could impress, but grain endured. It filled bowls quietly, predictably, without demanding attention. And that quiet was exactly what made it powerful. Grain does not rush, it waits. It sits in storage, patient and obedient, ready to be released when needed. Unlike livestock, it does not panic. Unlike soldiers, it does not defect. It stays where it is placed, becoming the most trustworthy resident of the empire. Control of starch meant control of time. Harvest defined seasons. Storage defined security. Distribution defined loyalty. If grain flowed, stability followed. If it stopped, questions began to surface. The empire learned quickly which outcome it preferred. Rice carried the heaviest symbolism of all. For the Mongols, it was not ancestral food, it was acquired sustenance. Every bowl represented land absorbed, farmers redirected, and fields quietly reassigned to serve a new center. Rice was not just eaten, it was claimed. Late at night, this feels almost elegant. Conquest without fire, authority without shouting, a territory fed into submission through daily repetition. No speeches required, just warm bowls arriving on time. Millet and wheat played similar roles, less glamorous but equally essential. They filled stomachs without ceremony, they stabilized labor forces. They allowed people to think about tomorrow instead of survival. And when people think about tomorrow, they tend to stay where they are. This is where starch becomes policy. Fields are surveyed, yields are recorded. Grain moves through bureaucratic channels as carefully as orders or laws. The empire does not need to remind people who rules them. Their meals do that gently. There is a quiet irony here. A nomadic empire, once defined by movement, learning to rely on crops that refuse to move at all, mobility slowing into administration, speed transforming into storage. Late at night, this transition feels natural. Empires age the way people do. They trade excitement for predictability. They stop running and start organizing. And starch becomes the glue that holds everything in place. This was not indulgence, it was infrastructure. Grain built calm, calm built obedience. And obedience, once fed daily, rarely needed to be demanded. The empire did not conquer land only with armies. It conquered it with carbohydrates, served warm, repeated endlessly, and trusted to do their quiet work. Late at night, when the stomach is quiet and the mind drifts slowly, it becomes easier to understand why starch was such a reliable ally of power. Grain does not excite, it soothes. It settles the body into acceptance, and acceptance is one of the most underrated forces in history. In Kublai Khan's empire, starch worked silently. Rice bowls arrived day after day, unremarkable in appearance, identical in purpose. This repetition was not accidental. It trained expectations. People stopped imagining alternatives. They organized their lives around continuity instead of resistance. Unlike meat, grain does not announce excess. It does not overwhelm the senses. It reassures instead. A full bowl does not demand gratitude. It encourages calm. And calm populations are easier to govern than inspired ones. Rice became the clearest symbol of this quiet conquest. It represented the empire's ability to absorb China not through destruction, but through administration. Fields were measured, harvests taxed, surpluses stored. What once fed a local population now fed an empire. Late at night, this feels almost humorous. A vast political transformation reduced to logistics. Dynasties shifting hands while grain continues to grow, indifferent to banners or borders. Power learning that hunger creates rebellion, but fullness creates patience. Noodles extended this logic even further. Long, flexible, endlessly adaptable, they mirrored the empire itself. They crossed regions, blended traditions, and made themselves familiar everywhere they went. Eating the same starch quietly, aligned people with the same system. Wheat and millet filled the spaces rice could not. They stabilized colder regions. They fed laborers and soldiers alike. They ensured that no part of the empire felt completely abandoned. Starch created inclusion without conversation. There is a soft irony here. An empire known for conquest, discovering that stability tastes bland. That control works best when it feels boring. The absence of hunger dulled urgency. The predictability of meals softened edges. Late at night, this boredom feels heavy but safe. It presses gently on the chest, encouraging rest rather than thought. The empire learned to cultivate this feeling deliberately. Grain became a promise, not of prosperity, but of continuity. Tomorrow will look like today. Today was survivable, therefore tomorrow will be too. This was enough. The empire did not need to shout its authority. It steamed it, boiled it, and served it daily. Starch replaced fear with routine. Routine replaced rebellion with habit. And so the empire endured, fed not by ambition alone, but by carbohydrates. Rice bowls quieted minds. Wheat filled calendars. Noodles stretched across regions like soft threads, holding everything together. Late at night, history whispers this truth gently. Power does not always arrive on horseback. Sometimes it arrives in a bowl, warm, familiar, and very hard to refuse. Late at night, when everything slows enough to notice patterns instead of events, the true role of starch becomes impossible to ignore. Grain was never dramatic, never loud, never heroic, and yet it was the most dependable ally power could ever ask for. Starch does not inspire revolutions. It prevents them. In Kublai Khan's empire, grain quietly absorbed tension. When rice arrived on time, dissatisfaction softened. When wheat filled storage houses, uncertainty lost its edge. People with full stomachs rarely hurry toward change. They settle instead. They wait. They adjust. This was the genius of starch as a political tool. It did not demand loyalty. It created comfort. And comfort, once established, rarely questions the hand that provides it. Late at night, this strategy feels almost tender. Not kind exactly, but careful. The empire learned that stability could be fed into existence slowly, bowl by bowl. No force required, no spectacle necessary. Rice became habit. Habit became normality. And normality became power. population did not wake each morning thinking about who ruled them. They thought about meals, work, and rest. Authority dissolved into routine so completely that it no longer needed to be asserted. It was simply present, like grain itself. There is a soft, ironic humor in this. A conquering empire discovering that the most effective weapon was bland, that the strongest hold over land was exercised not through fear, but through digestion. Late at night, the banality of it all feels almost unsettling. So much history shaped by something so quiet. Fields planted, harvests collected, bowls filled, lives organized around the certainty of starch. This certainty created patience. Patience dulled resistance. Resistance faded into habit, and habit became indistinguishable from acceptance. The empire did not eliminate hunger entirely. It eliminated unpredictability. And unpredictability is far more dangerous to power than dissatisfaction. As long as tomorrow looked like today, the system held. Grain flowed steadily from soil to storehouse to table, each step carefully managed, each step reinforcing the same message: stay, continue, do not rush. Late at night, this message feels heavy but calm, like a blanket pulled gently over restless thoughts. The empire did not need to convince people it was eternal. It only needed to convince them that it was stable. And stability, once fed daily, feels permanent. So the empire endured, not shouting its dominance, not displaying its strength, but quietly nourishing it. Rice bowls repeated the same promise every day. Wheat filled the gaps. Noodles stitched regions together with soft familiarity. History often remembers battles, names, and dates. But late at night, it remembers this instead: that an empire once learned how to conquer land with starch, and for a long while, it worked. The power did not roar, it simmered. And in that slow, gentle simmer, the empire rested, confident that as long as the grain kept coming, everything else would remain exactly where it was. Chapter 5: A Little Spice for a Very Large Empire. Late at night, when the world smells faintly of dust and quiet, history begins to talk about things that are small, delicate, and deceptively powerful. Not armies, not borders, but spices. Tiny, fragrant reminders that power does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it drifts in on the air. In Kublai Khan's empire, spices were never ordinary. They were rare, expensive, and carefully displayed. A pinch of pepper was not seasoning. It was a message. Cinnamon was not sweetness. It was geography. Every dish carried more than flavor. It carried distance. Spices did not grow everywhere. That was precisely why they mattered. To possess them meant controlling roads, ports, caravans, and people who never appeared at the table. Each grain of spice had traveled farther than most humans ever would. Its presence whispered stories of deserts crossed, oceans endured, and hands exchanged. Late at night, this feels almost intimate. A meal quietly narrating an empire's reach. You did not need a map. You could smell one. The kitchens used spices sparingly but deliberately, not to enhance food but to enhance meaning. A dish lightly dusted with imported flavor announced that the empire's influence extended well beyond its borders. That trade routes obeyed. That merchants cooperated. That distance had been domesticated. There is a dry humor in this, An empire famous for conquest, choosing fragrance as proof of dominance. Not steel, not fire, just aroma, drifting gently across the table. Spices also served another purpose, one history rarely mentions directly. They were excellent at hiding flaws, tough meat, aging grain, dishes prepared too long ago. A generous hand with seasoning softened realities that might otherwise be noticed. Flavor became camouflage. Late at night, this irony settles comfortably. The same substances used to impress guests also protected the illusion of abundance. When food smelled rich, it felt rich. The senses were convinced before the mind could question. Guests did not ask where the spices came from. They did not need to. Their presence answered the question implicitly. Somewhere far away, someone was producing something valuable, and it was ending up here. That was enough. In this way, every meal became a miniature version of the empire itself. Ingredients from different lands combined into something coherent, orderly, and carefully controlled. Nothing clashed, nothing overwhelmed. Everything knew its place. Spices were not essential to survival. That was what made them powerful. They existed beyond necessity, and power always enjoys what is unnecessary but attainable. Late at night, this subtlety feels almost poetic. The empire announcing its reach not through force, but through fragrance. A reminder that control does not always need to be visible. Sometimes it only needs to smell convincing. And so the spices lingered in the air, long after the plates were cleared. Quiet proof that the empire's influence extended farther than the eye could see and softer than the hand could feel. Late at night, when the air itself feels slower, it becomes easier to understand why spices mattered so deeply to power. They were not filling. They did not quiet hunger. Instead, they awakened attention. And attention, once captured, could be gently directed wherever authority wished it to go. In Kublai Khan's empire, spices functioned like quiet announcements. They did not shout, they hinted. A trace of pepper suggested distant markets still flowing. A note of cinnamon implied that caravans remained obedient to schedules drawn far away from the table. Flavor became reassurance, delivered through the senses rather than words. Every seasoned dish acted as a small map, not drawn in ink but in aroma. The roots that brought these spices were invisible yet undeniable. Roads across deserts, ships across water, merchants across borders. All of it condensed into something light enough to sprinkle. Late at night, this compression feels almost magical. Vast systems reduced to taste, control rendered edible. The presence of spices reassured guests that the empire's reach had not frayed. Trade routes still belonged to someone, that someone was sitting nearby, eating calmly. No explanation was required. The food explained everything. There is a quiet irony in how little spice was actually needed. Just enough to be noticed. Too much would overwhelm. Power, like seasoning, works best when applied with restraint. The empire understood this instinctively. Spices also carried a more practical function. They softened imperfections. Meat that had traveled too far, grain that had waited too long, dishes prepared in impossible quantities. Fragrance smoothed over rough edges. Aroma convinced the senses before judgment could form. Late at night, this feels gently humorous. A system so vast relying on scent to maintain illusion. The nose persuaded to ignore what the mouth might otherwise question. Guests rarely commented on flavor itself. They commented on richness, on abundance, on how impressive everything felt. This was the goal. Quality could fluctuate. Quantity, masked by spice, appeared consistent. In this way, spices became guardians of the narrative. They protected the story the empire wanted to tell about itself, a story of endless reach, of seamless control, of prosperity flowing inward without resistance. Spices were not consumed casually, they were experienced. Their rarity made them memorable. Their presence elevated meals beyond sustenance into performance. Eating became participation in the empire's success. Late at night, this performance feels delicate, almost fragile. So much meaning resting on something that could be crushed between fingers. Yet that fragility was part of the allure. Power enjoys what is difficult to obtain. The empire did not need spices to survive. That was precisely why they mattered. They existed beyond necessity. They signaled excess without waste, refinement without softness. And so the air around the banquet table filled with layered scents, each one whispering the same message. The roads are open, the system holds. The truth, whatever it might be, can wait. Late at night, when the last echoes of conversation fade and only memory remains, the role of spice becomes clearer. It was never about hunger. It was about atmosphere. Spices shaped how power felt, not how it functioned. They wrapped authority in something pleasant, something convincing. In Kublai Khan's empire, fragrance became a form of soft control. You could not see it, could not hold it, but you could not ignore it either. Aroma slipped into the senses quietly, bypassing analysis. Before anyone asked questions, they had already been reassured. This is where spice did its most important work. It blurred edges, it softened truths. Meat that was tough, grain that was old, meals prepared too long in advance. None of this mattered as much once the air itself smelled rich. Perception adjusted, expectations lowered, satisfaction arrived early. Late at night, this feels almost amusing. A vast empire trusting its image to something so fragile, a breeze could scatter it, a moment could erase it. And yet, while it lingered, it was powerful enough. Spices allowed the empire to appear refined without changing its structure. The food did not need to improve. The system did not need to slow down. A little fragrance created the illusion of care, of attention, of quality. Guests carried these impressions away with them. They remembered scent more than texture, warmth more than detail. The story traveled farther than the spice itself ever could. Reputation expanded quietly. This is the subtle brilliance of it all. Roads and caravans did not need to be explained. Control of trade routes did not need to be announced. The presence of spice implied everything. If cinnamon reached the table, the roads were secure. If pepper appeared regularly, distance had been conquered. Late at night, this implication feels heavy but calm. Power did not need to speak. It breathed. There is an irony here that history smiles at gently. Spices, once chased across oceans and deserts, reduced to finishing touches. Their rarity made them symbols. Their use made them tools. Their scent became reassurance. In the end, spices were never meant to nourish. They were meant to persuade, to distract, to convince those at the table that everything beyond it was under control, even if it wasn't. And so the empire scented its meals carefully. Not too much, not too little, just enough to maintain the illusion that abundance was effortless and quality unquestionable. Late at night, this illusion feels tender and fragile, like smoke hanging in still air. It lasts only as long as nothing disturbs it. But while it lasts, it works. The empire does not roar. It simmers, it seasons. It allows aroma to do what force does not need to. And when the plates are cleared, the scent remains just a moment longer. A final whisper that the truth, whatever it might be, has been gently covered for now. Chapter 6: The Art of Diplomacy Through an Unrefusable Cup. Late at night, when the body is finally allowed to rest, history begins to speak more honestly about discomfort. Not the dramatic kind, not pain or violence, but the quieter discomforts that test patience, endurance, and social obedience. Few things reveal power more gently than a drink that cannot be refused. In the court of Kublai Khan, Irog was more than a beverage. It was a ritual. Fermented mare's milk, cloudy and sharp, served not for pleasure but for participation. To drink was to belong, at least temporarily. To refuse was to stand apart. Irag appeared early and often. It flowed during meetings, celebrations, and moments meant to signal unity. The cup was offered calmly, without explanation, as if acceptance were obvious. And in this calm, obligation hid itself well. Late at night, it becomes easier to see how clever this was. No threats, no raised voices, just a cup, held patiently, waiting to be taken. The choice existed only in theory. In practice, there was only one correct response. Drinking Arag was not about taste. Many guests found it difficult, even unpleasant. The texture surprised them, the flavor lingered longer than expected, but discomfort was part of the design. Endurance mattered more than enjoyment. This is where diplomacy turned quietly physical. The body of the guest became the testing ground. Could they swallow without hesitation? Could they keep their composure? Could they continue drinking when politeness demanded it? Acceptance was measured not in words, but in tolerance. Late at night, this feels almost intimate. Loyalty assessed through digestion. Allegiance confirmed through the stomach. The empire did not ask for declarations. It watched reactions. To refuse the cup was not merely impolite, it disrupted the ritual, it suggested distance. Worse, it implied judgment. And judgment, in a system built on harmony and hierarchy, was dangerous. There is a dry irony here, an empire spanning continents using fermented milk to enforce social order. No armies required, just tradition, repetition, and the quiet pressure of expectation. Arag unified the room by making everyone equally vulnerable. No one drank it effortlessly. Even those accustomed to it respected its strength. The shared experience created a sense of belonging through endurance rather than comfort. Late at night, this strategy feels strangely elegant. Power expressed not through fear, but through participation. If you could drink, you could stay. If you stayed, you complied. The cup did not threaten, it invited. And in that invitation, authority wrapped itself in courtesy. So Irag continued to circulate, cup after cup, smoothing conversations, testing boundaries, and quietly reminding everyone present that diplomacy was not always spoken. Sometimes it was swallowed. As the night deepened, the cup kept returning, not urgently, not aggressively. It arrived with a calm that made refusal feel awkward rather than dangerous. This was the genius of it. Power that never raised its voice rarely needed to. The guests learned quickly that Arag was not meant to be finished once. It was refilled, again and again. Each round softened conversation and sharpened awareness. The body warmed, the tongue loosened, judgment slowed. Late at night, this feels almost merciful. The Empire did not demand clarity, it preferred fog. Agreements made under the gentle blur of fermented milk felt smoother, less sharp at the edges. Memory, conveniently, became flexible. Arag blurred hierarchy without removing it. Everyone drank, but not equally. Cups closer to the Khan were filled first. Those farther away waited longer, watched more, and drank colder portions. Even intoxication followed rank. There is something quietly amusing about this. Diplomacy measured not in treaties, but in refill timing. Influence revealed not by words, but by how quickly a servant returned to your side. Guests learned to pace themselves. Drinking too eagerly looked desperate. Drinking too slowly looked suspicious. The ideal rhythm was careful compliance, a steady swallowing of expectation. Late at night, this balancing act feels exhausting, and that was part of its purpose. Fatigue softened resistance. Tired guests argued less, they nodded more, they agreed faster. The body, after all, is easier to govern when it is busy, surviving mild discomfort. Some guests smiled through it, others laughed too loudly. A few grew quiet, retreating inward as the room swayed gently around them. All were observed, every reaction noted without comment. Arag did not punish openly, it revealed. Those who handled it well appeared adaptable. Those who struggled were remembered, not condemned, just categorized. In an empire that valued order, classification was power. Late at night, one realizes how subtle this system was. No threats, no humiliation, just repetition. The cup returned and returned and returned again until behavior settled into something predictable. Even the strongest guests eventually surrendered to routine. Lift the cup, drink, exhale, repeat. Conversation became softer, time stretched, resistance dissolved into habit. There is a quiet irony in this scene. An empire built by conquest, maintaining peace through fermented milk. A court that ruled continents, trusting loyalty tests to digestion. Yet it worked, because it respected appearances. Everyone chose to drink. Technically, the empire never forced. It simply waited. Late at night, this feels like the most effective form of control, one that allows the subject to believe they are participating willingly. The cup was never empty for long. Neither was the message it carried. To belong, you drank. To remain, you endured. To leave unmarked, you learned to swallow without complaint. And so diplomacy continued, not with speeches, but with patience. Not with commands, but with cups. Passed gently from hand to hand, asking the same quiet question every time. Can you take one more? As the night moved closer to dawn, the cups grew heavier, not in weight, but in meaning. Arag no longer felt like a drink. It felt like a clock, quietly counting down endurance. Each sip marked time. Each swallow confirmed presence. By this hour, conversation had softened into murmurs. Laughter came slower, lower, as if careful not to disturb the fragile balance of the room. The empire, at rest for a moment, watched itself breathe. Guests who remained upright were no longer proving loyalty. They were proving resilience. Their bodies had absorbed the ritual. Resistance had faded into routine. The cup rose almost automatically now. Late at night, this is where diplomacy reveals its final shape. Not persuasion, not intimidation, just exhaustion. When the body grows tired, it stops arguing. It accepts what is offered simply to maintain equilibrium. The Khan did not need to speak much. His presence alone steadied the rhythm. When he lifted his cup, the room followed. When he paused, the servants paused. Authority expressed itself through timing, not volume. There is something gently absurd here. An empire vast enough to bend geography, maintained by a shared tolerance for sour milk. Borders enforced not only by soldiers, but by social rituals that quietly filtered who could endure proximity to power. Late at night, the irony feels softer, almost affectionate. The empire trusted its guests to reveal themselves without pressure. All it had to do was keep pouring. Some guests would wake the next morning proud of their endurance. Others would wake confused, uncertain what they had agreed to, only that they had agreed. Both outcomes were acceptable. Stability mattered more than clarity. This was the final elegance of the system. It did not seek enthusiasm. It accepted compliance. A nod was enough. A raised cup sufficient. Iraq did not inspire devotion. It encouraged alignment. And alignment, repeated often enough, became loyalty in practice, if not in feeling. As the night thinned and the cups finally rested, the room settled into a shared quiet. Servants moved softly. The floor held the memory of spilled drops. The air carried a faint, lingering sourness. Late at night, one understands that diplomacy does not always end with signatures or speeches. Sometimes it ends with silence, with guests too tired to disagree, with bodies that have learned the cost of refusal. The empire slept well after nights like this, not because everyone was happy, but because everything was predictable. The ritual had done its work. And somewhere, long after the cups were cleared, the lesson remained. Power does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers, gently, persistently, asking the same simple question, "Will you drink?" And most did. Not because they wanted to, but because it was easier than saying no. Chapter 7. When the seat matters more than the food. Late at night, history stops shouting and begins arranging chairs. This is the hour when empires reveal what they truly value, not the sword, not the speech, but the distance between one seat and another. In Kublai Khan's grand banquets, food was abundant, but position was everything. Tens of thousands gathered, yet not everyone arrived equally. Some walked closer to the center. Others learned immediately how far they stood from power. The banquet space itself was a map, a soft one, no borders drawn in ink, only carpets, platforms, and carefully measured gaps. The closer you sat to the Khan, the warmer your food arrived. The farther you were, the longer you waited, watching steam fade into memory. Late at night, this feels almost tender in its cruelty. No one needed to be told where they stood. The temperature of the meat explained everything. These banquets were not designed for conversation. They were designed for awe. Rows upon rows of bodies, plates moving like slow tides, servants gliding in practiced patterns. The scale overwhelmed thought. When the mind is busy counting people, it forgets to question why it is there. Food arrived whole. Entire animals carried past wide eyes. Quantity replaced refinement. The message was simple and heavy. There is more where this came from, and you are very small inside it. Late at night, one notices how clever this was. You do not need to intimidate someone who already feels insignificant. You simply surround them with abundance until resistance feels pointless. Eating became secondary. Watching became essential. Guests observed who was served first, who was ignored longest, who received fresh dishes, who received leftovers. Every movement taught hierarchy more effectively than any announcement. There was humor here if one dared to notice it. Food, the thing meant to comfort, turned into a ruler, not for measuring hunger but importance. Calories were plentiful. Recognition was scarce. The banquet did not ask if you were satisfied. It asked if you understood. Late at night, the irony softens. An empire powerful enough to feed everyone chose instead to feed awareness, to remind each guest gently but firmly exactly where they belonged. The seat did the speaking. The food merely filled the silence. As the night deepened, the banquet settled into rhythm. Not a joyful rhythm, but a controlled one. Servants moved with precision, never rushing, never hesitating. Plates arrived when they were meant to, not when hunger demanded. Late at night, it becomes clear that this was never about nourishment. Hunger was irrelevant. What mattered was observation. Who leaned forward? Who sat still? Who pretended not to notice the delay? Hierarchy expressed itself through patience. Those closer to power waited less and spoke less. Those farther away waited longer and spoke carefully, measuring each word against the distance between themselves and the center. The temperature of food became a language. Warm meant remembered. Lukewarm meant tolerated. Cold meant forgotten. No one complained. Complaints would only confirm one's position. Late at night, this feels almost polite. No punishments, no corrections, just consequences, served quietly on wooden trays. The sheer number of guests ensured anonymity for most. This too was intentional. When you are one among thousands, individuality dissolves. The banquet did not need your name, it only needed your presence. Eating became mechanical. Bite, chew, swallow, watch, repeat. The body complied while the mind drifted, lulled by fullness and fatigue. There is a dry humor in this arrangement. People traveled across continents to attend, only to realize the food mattered less than where they sat while eating it. The dish was not the prize. Visibility was. Late at night, this feels strangely modern. Status measured by proximity. Influence defined by access. Comfort distributed unevenly but predictably. The banquet overwhelmed the senses deliberately. Smells layered over one another, sounds blurred into a low hum. The brain, saturated, stopped resisting. Submission arrived quietly, disguised as exhaustion. By the time dessert appeared, few noticed its taste. They noticed instead who received it first, who received it at all. The empire did not need loyalty proclaimed. It needed hierarchy accepted. And acceptance came easiest when wrapped in ritual. Late at night, one understands the brilliance of this design. Food distracts. Seating instructs. And everyone learns the lesson, even if no one speaks it aloud. As the night approached its quiet end, the banquet softened, not because it grew kind, but because its work was finished. The guests were full, the hierarchy was clear. Nothing more needed to be said. Late at night, this is when the truth becomes visible. Food was never the subject. It was the scenery, a carefully arranged backdrop for a lesson about place. Plates were cleared slowly, bones stacked neatly. The remnants of abundance gathered and removed, leaving behind only memory and mild discomfort. Those closest to power rose first. Others waited, unsure if standing too early would be noticed. Even departure followed rank. There is something gently ironic here. So much effort, so many resources, all to teach something that could have been announced in a sentence. But announcements fade, experiences linger. Late at night, the mind returns not to flavors, but to moments. The delay before your plate arrived, the way a servant avoided your eyes, the warmth of the dish compared to the one beside you. The banquet succeeded because it never argued. It demonstrated. Food acted as a prop in a theater of dominance. A roasted animal meant nothing by itself. Carried past hundreds, before reaching one person, it became meaning. The guests left changed, though few could articulate how. They felt smaller, or safer, or strangely grateful, despite everything. Late at night, this feels like the quietest form of control. One that leaves no scars, only awareness. The empire did not need to follow anyone home. The lesson traveled with them, in how they sat at future tables, in how they waited, in how they judged distance. There is a soft humor in imagining future banquets elsewhere, smaller, quieter, still echoing this design. Chairs arranged carefully, plates distributed strategically, power whispering through logistics. By the time sleep arrives, history feels less dramatic and more domestic, less about conquest, more about seating plans. And perhaps that is the final irony. Empires rise and fall, but hierarchy survives, served warm to some, cold to others. Late at night, when the noise fades, history does not shout. It pulls out a chair and waits to see where you choose to sit. Chapter 8: Living Close to Nature, the Imperial Way. Late at night, the idea of living close to nature sounds comforting. A quiet forest, open skies, the gentle illusion of simplicity. But when an emperor goes hunting, nature becomes something else entirely. It becomes a destination that must be prepared. For Kublai Khan, hunting was not an escape from power. It was power, carefully relocated. When the court moved into the wilderness, it did not travel lightly. It arrived with wagons, animals, servants, cooks, guards, scribes, and expectations. Late at night, this feels almost humorous. The idea of simplicity requiring thousands of people, the forest waiting patiently while an empire sets up camp inside it. The hunting expeditions functioned like slow-moving cities. Tents replaced walls, fires replaced hearths. Kitchens appeared where moments earlier there had only been grass. Nothing was improvised. Everything was planned. Nature was not trusted to provide. It was supplemented. Herds were driven alongside the court just in case the land failed to cooperate. Rivers were crossed only after bridges were prepared. Comfort did not adapt. It arrived intact. Late at night, one begins to see the pattern. The emperor did not enter nature to submit to it. He entered to demonstrate that it could be managed. The hunt itself was ceremonial. Animals were driven into position, paths were cleared, observers were stationed. What looked like wilderness was, in reality, choreography. There is a quiet irony here. The image of a ruler close to the land, living as his nomadic ancestors once did, required more structure than the palace ever had. Late at night, this feels like a confession disguised as tradition. Power does not relax. It relocates. The forest became a stage. Trees stood as witnesses. Animals played assigned roles. The emperor moved through it all, calm, deliberate, never inconvenienced. To outsiders, it looked like harmony, man and nature together. To those who carried the tents, hauled the cauldrons, and fed the fires, it felt like administration with better scenery. Nature, in this context, was not wild. It was temporarily leased. And late at night, when the firelight flickers, one realizes the hunt was never about animals. It was about proving that even the forest could be organized. As the night deepened, the hunting camp revealed its true form. It was not a camp at all. It was a palace that had learned to move. Silk tents replaced stone halls, carpets softened the earth, tables stood level on uneven ground. Nothing essential was left behind. Comfort traveled faithfully like a loyal servant. Late at night, this feels strangely soothing. The idea that power does not fear change in scenery because it brings itself wherever it goes. The Khan's tent stood at the center, larger, quieter, better guarded. Around it, other tents formed invisible circles of importance. Distance still mattered. Proximity still spoke. The wilderness did not erase hierarchy. It clarified it. Meals were prepared with the same precision as in the capital. Fires burned at the right temperature. Dishes arrived on time. Even far from the city, the rhythm remained unchanged. Late at night, one notices how little nature actually mattered. It framed the experience, but did not define it. The hunt could have taken place anywhere. The outcome would have felt the same. The image of nomadic life was carefully preserved. Horses, open skies, movement. Yet behind it all stood a logistical machine refined over generations. There is a soft humor in this contradiction. The emperor honoring simplicity through overwhelming complexity. Guests were meant to admire the balance, the ability to live among trees without sacrificing order, the illusion of effortlessness created by immense effort. Late at night, this illusion becomes transparent. Power does not blend with nature. It overlays it. The hunt reinforced identity. Nomadic roots remembered but improved. Mobility without vulnerability. Freedom without uncertainty. The emperor moved through the landscape like a passing season, temporary yet commanding, leaving little behind except impressions and trampled grass. By morning, the camp could vanish. By evening, it could reappear elsewhere, unchanged. Nature adjusted. The empire did not. Late at night, one understands that this was the message. The land does not shape the ruler. The ruler shapes how the land is experienced. And the palace, wherever it rested, remained complete. As the night grew quiet, the hunt slowed. Fires dimmed. Conversations softened. The forest, having performed its role, waited silently. Late at night, this is when the final meaning settles in. Nature was present but never central. It served as backdrop, not authority. The emperor did not seek wilderness for unpredictability. He sought it for contrast, silk against bark, order against chaos, control against openness. The hunt displayed mastery without confrontation. No speeches were needed. The message lived in the details. Warm meals far from cities, clean water where none was expected, comfort delivered on schedule. Late at night, this feels almost tender. A ruler reassuring himself that nothing was beyond reach. Animals taken during the hunt were not trophies of survival. They were confirmations, proof that the land could still provide when asked properly, the court observed. Guests nodded. The lesson repeated itself quietly. Nature did not resist. It never does, when resistance is unnecessary. There is a dry irony in how often rulers claim closeness to nature while reshaping it entirely. The forest was not respected for its independence. It was admired for its flexibility. Late at night, this becomes clear. Nature in this story is not a partner. It is scenery. The hunt ended. The camp prepared to move. The land exhaled, relieved of structure. The empire folded itself neatly and continued onward. Nothing essential was lost. Nothing essential ever is. As sleep approaches, history feels less violent and more logistical, less heroic and more practical. Empires endure not by dominating nature, but by redefining it. And so the emperor rode on, carrying comfort, hierarchy, and certainty into the open world. Nature watched, patient as always, knowing it would remain long after the tents were gone. Late at night, that thought is strangely calming. Chapter 9, Because Not Everyone Gets Dessert. Late at night, sweetness feels unnecessary. The body no longer asks for it. The mind drifts more easily without it. And perhaps that is why, in imperial history, sugar was never meant for everyone. In Kublai Khan's world, sweetness was rare by design, not because it was impossible to obtain, but because it was too useful to waste. Sugar, honeyed fruits, candied treats, these were not foods, they were signals. Late at night, it becomes easier to understand this logic. Scarcity creates attention. Attention creates meaning. Dessert did not appear at the end of every banquet. Sometimes it did not appear at all. When it did, it arrived quietly, selectively, without announcement. A plate placed here, a bowl passed there. Others watched, pretending not to notice. Sweetness was never about satisfaction. It was about distinction. Those who received it understood immediately. This was not generosity. It was recognition. A reminder that they were seen, counted, included, at least for this moment. Those who did not receive it also understood, perhaps even more clearly. Late at night, this feels gently cruel, but efficient. Sugar did not need to be explained. Its absence spoke fluently. The empire used sweetness the way it used silence, carefully, sparingly, with purpose. Desserts were small, modest in size, rich in implication. They disappeared quickly, leaving behind a faint memory and a sharper awareness of who had tasted them. There is a dry humor here. After mountains of meat and rivers of drink, what mattered most was a spoonful of sweetness. Power condensed into something fragile enough to dissolve on the tongue. Late at night, one realizes how deliberate this was. Excess everywhere, except where it mattered most. Sweetness trained desire. It taught patience. It reminded guests that pleasure was conditional. And in that reminder, hierarchy settled gently, like sugar dust on silk. As the night deepened, the logic behind dessert grew clearer. Scarcity was not a problem to be solved. It was a resource to be managed. Sugar traveled far. It required effort, coordination, trade. But the empire did not struggle to obtain it. It struggled to decide who deserved it. Late at night, this distinction matters. Difficulty creates value, but control creates power. Desserts were distributed deliberately, never evenly. Equality would have ruined the effect. The imbalance was the point. A guest might enjoy sweetness once and never again. Another might receive it regularly. Patterns emerged. Observers learned. Late at night, this feels like a quiet lesson in economics. Supply exists, access does not. Sweetness did not reward hunger. It rewarded position. It marked trust, favor, or temporary usefulness. There is something softly ironic about this. The most harmless pleasure used as one of the sharpest tools. Desserts were often simple, dried fruits glazed with honey, small cakes, nuts coated lightly, nothing extravagant by modern standards, yet their rarity amplified their impact. Late at night, memory exaggerates these flavors, not because they were extraordinary, but because they were withheld. Those who did not receive dessert often convinced themselves they did not want it. A common survival strategy. The empire relied on this psychology. Desire reshaped itself to match reality. Acceptance followed. Sweetness, when granted, felt intimate, almost personal, a quiet acknowledgement that you mattered, if only briefly. Late at night, this feels more effective than praise. Praise fades. Taste lingers. Scarcity created stories. Guests carried them home. Who received dessert? Who did not? Why? The empire did not correct these stories. It allowed them to circulate. Power, after all, travels best when people repeat it voluntarily. As the night moved toward rest, the banquet softened. Plates cleared. Voices lowered. The memory of sweetness hovered gently, unevenly distributed. Late at night, this is when the aftertaste matters more than the flavor itself. Dessert had done its work. It left behind clarity without confrontation. No one needed to argue about rank. The table had already spoken. Those who tasted sweetness felt chosen. Those who did not felt instructed. There is a quiet irony in how little sugar was required. A symbol does not need abundance. It needs contrast. Late at night, one sees how power prefers subtlety when it can afford it. The empire did not rely on fear alone. Fear exhausts. Scarcity educates. Sweetness became a memory attached to authority. Pleasant, brief, conditional. Guests learned to associate pleasure with permission, to wait, to hope, to behave. This was not cruelty. It was refinement. Late at night, the lesson feels almost gentle. power that does not rush, power that allows desire to mature. The banquet ended, guests departed. Some carried sweetness on their tongues, others carried it only in thought. Both carried the message. Dessert was never about taste. It was about boundaries, about reminding everyone that not everything available is accessible. Late at night, this feels strangely modern. Luxury defined by limitation, status defined by access. The empire slept well after nights like this. The hierarchy remained intact. No enforcement required. Sugar, quiet and rare, had done what soldiers could not. As sleep arrives, history becomes softer, less violent, more precise. And one final thought drifts through the mind. In empires, as in life, sweetness is sweetest when it is not meant for everyone. Chapter 10. When there is nothing left to eat but the past. Late at night, abundance begins to feel heavy. Not comforting, not impressive, just heavy. This is the hour when history stops admiring its own excess and starts noticing the cost of carrying it. In the later years of Kublai Khan's rule, the banquets continued, the kitchens burned, and the logistics moved forward. But something subtle had changed. The system still worked. That was the problem. The empire had grown used to feeding its image. Mountains of food, rivers of drink, endless demonstrations of capacity. Each feast was meant to reassure everyone that nothing had diminished. That control remained absolute. That supply was infinite. Late at night, this insistence feels nervous. The kitchens demanded more, the routes stretched longer. The labor intensified, resources moved faster than they could rest. But the spectacle could not pause. A pause would invite questions. So, the banquets continued, not because hunger existed, but because doubt did. The empire consumed, not to survive, but to prove it could still consume. Late at night, one begins to notice how systems behave when they fear stillness. They grow louder, bigger, more elaborate. Excess becomes a defense mechanism. Each feast reassured the present at the expense of the future. Livestock vanished on schedule. Granaries emptied quietly. Replenishment became more complex, more fragile. But the table never showed this. The table only showed fullness. There is a quiet irony here. An empire powerful enough to organize the world struggled to organize restraint. Late at night, the metaphor becomes obvious. Eating past hunger is rarely about appetite. It is about anxiety. The banquets reflected this perfectly. They no longer celebrated success. They protected the illusion of permanence. Guests still marveled. Servants still moved precisely. But beneath the rhythm tension lived. The system could not stop consuming without admitting limits. And limits were the one thing power refused to digest. As the night deepened, the banquets began to resemble reflections more than achievements. Each feast repeated familiar patterns, the same scale, the same abundance, the same gestures. What once felt triumphant now felt rehearsed. Late at night, repetition is revealing. The empire was no longer expanding its reach. It was circling its habits, feeding itself images it already knew by heart. The logistics still functioned, but only just. Each successful banquet required greater effort than the last. More coordination, more pressure, more silent compromise. Yet nothing changed outwardly. That was the rule. Late at night, this feels like watching someone smile through exhaustion. The banquets no longer proved strength. They concealed fragility. Excess became camouflage. Guests noticed without speaking. Food still arrived, but sometimes later. Still plentiful, but occasionally uneven. Small inconsistencies appeared, quickly covered by spectacle. The empire trusted that no one would question a table overflowing with food. And most did not. There is a soft, almost sad humor here. Power working harder to appear effortless. Late at night, one understands that systems rarely collapse loudly. They stretch, they strain, they compensate. The feasts continued not because they were sustainable, but because they were familiar. Tradition replaced reason, habit replaced adaptation. The past became the menu. Every banquet repeated earlier triumphs, earlier confidence, earlier abundance. The empire was no longer eating the present, it was consuming memory. Late at night, this is deeply human. When the future feels uncertain, we return to what once worked. The banquet table became a shrine to former certainty. Each dish whispered, "We have always eaten this way." But history is patient. It waits while systems pretend, and eventually the mirror grows difficult to ignore. As the night approached rest, the banquet softened into habit. The motions continued, but the meaning thinned. Late at night, this is when the final truth settles gently. Power, like the body, has limits. It can consume only so much before nourishment turns into burden. The empire had eaten its way into stability, then eaten further to protect that stability. Eventually, there was nothing left to consume except the performance itself. The feasts no longer expanded influence, they maintained appearances. The table fed reputation, not resilience. Late at night, this feels almost tender. A system unwilling to admit it is tired. The abundance still impressed, but it no longer reassured. Excess without growth felt hollow. History does not end with famine or fire here. It ends with imbalance, with a system heavier than it can comfortably carry. The empire did not collapse at the table. It weakened quietly behind it. There is a gentle irony in this ending. After conquering lands, routes, and resources, power discovered it could not conquer its own appetite. Late at night, this lesson feels universal. Consumption cannot replace renewal. Spectacle cannot substitute balance. Even the largest systems must rest. The banquets fade from memory, not because they failed, but because they said the same thing too many times. When nothing new remains to eat, the past becomes the final course. And the past, no matter how rich, cannot sustain forever. As sleep arrives, history grows quiet. The table empties, the kitchen's dim. What remains is the simple truth power avoids until it must listen. Even empires must eventually stop eating. And that realization, strangely, is very calming. When everything finally unfolds, beautifully, like a quiet proof of history. It is late now, late enough that even history has begun to yawn. The table is quiet, the dishes are gone. Somewhere, a servant has finally sat down for the first time tonight. Somewhere else, a fire is burned low enough to stop pretending it will last forever. This is usually where stories end, with a conclusion, a lesson, a neat summary tied with confidence. But history, when spoken this softly, does not enjoy neat endings. It prefers leftovers. Because if you listen closely, long after the banners are folded and the banquets stop, you can still hear the sound of chewing. Empires do not disappear all at once. They fade like appetite. First comes excess, then habit, then the quiet realization that the body is tired. Even if the table is still full, Kublai Khan did not fall asleep thinking about collapse. No ruler ever does. He fell asleep knowing that tomorrow would require another meal, another demonstration, another assurance that the world still moved toward him. And for a long time it did. That is the strange comfort of power. It works until it doesn't. Not with a scream, but with indigestion. There is something faintly funny about this, if you allow yourself to smile. An empire capable of organizing continents, ultimately constrained by the same limits as everyone else. Hunger, habit, fatigue. History textbooks prefer turning points. We prefer bedtime stories. And bedtime stories understand something important. Repetition is revealing. What people do every day tells you far more than what they do once. Kublai Khan ate every day. So did his empire. The table was not just furniture. It was a system, a promise, a warning. It said, "This can happen again tomorrow." And for many years, that was true. But even the largest systems grow heavy. Even the grandest meals end. Even power needs rest, though it rarely admits it. Tonight, as you drift closer to sleep, you don't need to remember dates or names. Just remember the image. A vast table, firelight flickering, plates stacked a little too high, a ruler who does not need to speak because everything already moves toward him, and then gradually the quiet. That quiet is not failure. It is the sound of history exhaling. If this story unsettled you just a little, that is intentional. Not because it is frightening, but because it is familiar. We still live in systems built to feed appetites. We still confuse abundance with stability. We still sit at tables we did not build, eating food we did not grow, trusting that someone else has thought about tomorrow. For now, that is not your concern. It is late. Late enough that the world has stopped asking anything of you. So let the dishes stay unwashed. Let history close its mouth for the night. Let your thoughts loosen their grip and wander somewhere softer. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying until the last bite. Sleep well, rest deeply, and as always, good night.